Before we start our lesson this morning, I'd like to note that on the prayer list and the pew bulletin, there's several of our older members that are struggling with health issues right now, and one that is not here because it just happened late in the week. Brother Keith Parker suffered a broken hip. Fall on a broken hip, and is in the hospital with that, I believe. So we want to keep these people in mind, and if you would join with me in prayer, we'll open our time together this morning with a prayer just for these folks that are having these struggles. Dear Father, this morning we want to thank you for the privilege of being together, of calling you our Father, and of studying your Word. How encouraging it is to see the faces of these who are precious brothers and sisters and their desire to study your Word. We want to offer a special prayer this morning of intercession on behalf of those who are struggling with health issues, and some of these are serious. We pray for Sister Carol Wedge, who's normally a part of our class, that you would strengthen her. We pray for Lawrence Chandler and his struggle with cancer. We pray that Jeanette James will be able to go home very soon. We pray that you'd continue to strengthen and bless Christine Shivers. We pray for Keith Parker in his suffering, all those who love and care for him, and we want to offer a special and fervent prayer that you would strengthen and bless Brother Bruce Pennington, relieve his pain and his nausea. In Jesus' name, amen. And I'm sure that I left somebody out, and I want to say that was not intentional at all. So we're going to continue our study together of Matthew's Gospel, the last 8 chapters this summer. Surely he was the Son of God, and we find ourselves now at the very conclusion of Jesus' 5th great speech in the Gospel of Matthew. And this breaks itself into 2 or 3 parts, chapters 23, 24, 25. And chapter 25 is, well, first of all, I think you can all hear me. You look like you can hear me. You don't look like you're going to sleep or anything, so that's good. This is a series of parables about Jesus coming back again, about what you and I might call judgment or judgment day or the end of the world. In fact, the very end of chapter 24 is a parable, and we talked about this some last time. It's the parable I call the bad supervisor servant. And this master leaves his household, and he leaves one servant in charge. As a matter of fact, that's really not fair, because there are 2 supervisors that are described there. There's a good one, and he does everything he's supposed to do, and all is very well. He said, but he spends most of his time talking about the bad one. He says the bad one, he says, my master's, he's not coming back anytime soon. It's like he's delayed, and he begins to be very careless, and then he starts to abuse the other servants. It says he begins to beat them and eat and drink and get drunk. And he said the master will return at a time the servant does not expect him and punish him rather severely. So this is kind of a lead into these 3 very colorful stories that we have in chapter 25. So if the chapter divisions in the Bible are somewhat artificial. They were added after the original documents were written. And so we have a block here of 4 parables, 4 stories about Jesus' return again. The supervisor servant, the late bridegroom and the 10 maidens, the talents, and then the sheep and the goats, which is kind of a parable and kind of a prediction. But anyway, it's a very, very colorful story. So we have all these together. Now, when we read these stories, and who doesn't love a good story? In fact, it seems to me, if you compare a lot of the sermons that I hear today with those that I heard, 40, 50 years ago when Jim and I were younger, there's a lot of storytelling that goes on. And to capture our attention. And I remember my grandfather, he loved a good story. And like most old people like me, he told the same stories over and over again. But he loved a good story. He was a good storyteller. What does it take to make a good story? This is one of my favorite storytellers. If you're if you're my age and you grew up in the South, you may know Jerry Clower. And may have met him. I don't know. He liked to tell stories about growing up in Mississippi in the 1930s out in the country. And a good story is usually going to have, one that you tell orally, is going to have a simple plot, okay? Because otherwise you get too confused. You have a simple plot. It's just going to have a few characters that you really focus on. It's going to have vivid images drawn from everyday life. I still have a lot of Jerry Clower in my, iTunes or whatever, and I've heard these 1,000 times. But when he comes on, he starts telling a story, he'll inject some detail that just, I haven't noticed that before. And it's just beautiful. It's just because it's so true to life. Then there'll be some repetition. One of my favorite stories to tell kids are the three little pigs, okay? So, the three little pigs, the big bad wolf come along and, little pig, let me come in. Oh, no, not Mother Harold, my chitty chin chin. If you don't, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your little house in. So, that kind of repetition makes for a good story. It's easy to remember. So we see a lot of these elements of good oral storytelling in the parables that Jesus told. And then finally, and this is true, this is true of parables, maybe not so much of oral stories, but very much of parables, is there's one key idea, there's one key message we're trying to get across. And so it's up to us as Bible students, as followers of Jesus, to figure out what that message is that he's trying to share with us. Well, two of these stories in Matthew 25 have similar beginnings. They start off with the words, the kingdom of heaven will be like. The kingdom of heaven will be like. And we've already talked about, Matthew is a gospel all about the kingdom of heaven. It is a kingdom-centric gospel. And, like back in the Sermon on the Mount, very first verse of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven, it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So it's a very kingdom-centric gospel, and we see this expression, the kingdom of heaven is like, a whole bunch of places as we page through the Gospel of Matthew and study the parables, particularly in chapter 13, which is another one of Jesus' great speeches, great lectures or discourses. It's nothing but a collection of kingdom parables. But, if we erase everything we know about the kingdom and then just try to figure it out from what we read in Matthew, this is what we get. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, or it's like a mustard seed which a man took and planted, or it's like yeast that a woman put into 60 pounds of flour, or it's like a treasure hidden in a field, or it's like a merchant looking for fine pearls, or it's like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. Or it's like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. How can one thing be like all these different things? It's the concept of the kingdom is a little bit slippery. It's a little bit complicated. By the time you think you've got it really defined and clearly delineated, then you learn something else new about it. So Jesus is trying to give us different snapshots of what this kingdom is all about. So this brings us to the first of these three parables today. And so we'll just read from the opening verses of Matthew 25. We call this the parable of the 10 virgins, or the 10 maidens, or the 10 bridesmaids, okay? Then the kingdom of heaven shall be compared to 10 maidens who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Then all those maidens rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise replied, perhaps there will not be enough for us and for you. Go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other maidens came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he replied, Truly, I say to you, I do not know you. Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Well, in kind of parsing this thing out, there's a lot of questions that arise. But first of all, who is the bridegroom? Who is the bridegroom? And this is pretty obvious. Even going back into the Old Testament, it talks about God being like the husband or the bridegroom of his people, of Israel. And then just in the book of Matthew, we get this in chapter 9, verse 14. John's disciples came and asked him, why don't you and your disciples fast more often like we do and like the Pharisees do? And Jesus said, how can the guest of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? In other words, while I'm here, we're having a good time. We got a lot of stuff to do. We're not going to take a break and fast, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. And so it's part of our Christian life today to fast because the bridegroom has been taken away from us for a while. And you may remember back in chapter 22, we studied this great parable of the king's son, and we talked about royal weddings and what a big deal they are. And so it's pretty obvious in that chapter, in that parable, that the king is God and the son, the bridegroom, is Jesus. So we can figure this much out. The bridegroom is Jesus, okay? And, well, what about these bridesmaids, though? If the bridegroom is Jesus, who do the bridesmaids represent? In verse 13, the very end of the parable, kind of Jesus gives the moral to the story. He says, watch, therefore, for you do not know, you know neither the day nor the hour. He's talking to his followers. So if we're the ones that are supposed to be watching, then you and I are the bridegroom. And so I know all you guys out there are wondering, what colored dress would go with your eyes and that sort of thing. But anyway, you are a bridegroom. Okay. So that brings up a lot of questions about these. If we're supposed to be the bridesmaids, the virgins, the whatever, then this brings up a lot of questions. First of all, why is the bridegroom late? One thing that we believe in our culture is to start the wedding on time, As much as we want to start the wedding on time, we plan these things, 6 months, a year in advance. We want to start it on time, and there are people at my house that believe that, you can be late to Bible class, but you don't want to be late to the wedding, because if you get there too late, you don't get a good seat, and you're really not supposed to come in after the bride comes in. That's a no, you don't do that. You got to get there, get seated before the bride comes in so you can stand up and turn around and look at her come in, right? So you don't want to be late, but this bridegroom is late, and it's the groom, it's not the bride, okay? He's late. What's the problem? Why is it so important to meet him with lighted lamps? This is such a big deal. Got to have oil, because when he comes, we have to light our lamps. What's the story there? Here's one that I really like. The heroes of the story are the wise virgins, but they're selfish. The foolish virgins say, we don't have oil. We didn't bring any extra oil. Now, these lamps that they used back then, and maybe you've seen one. There's some that archaeologists have found, and this is a picture here, but some of them are just like the smallest cereal bowl that you have at your house, the smallest little fruit bowl or whatever you have, and they've got a little groove on one side where you could put a wick in it. It's not very fancy. It's not like a Coleman lantern butch that you can fill up and pump it up and it burns for hours and hours. It doesn't hold much oil. So if you're really serious about this thing, you're going to have a flask or a bottle of oil that you can replenish the thing with, because it's not going to burn very long. Okay, but anyway, these guys are the heroes, but they're selfish. And then when the foolish virgins get shut out because they had to go buy some oil, and something tells me that in the first century, Walmart wasn't open 24 hours. Is it open 24 hours now, by the way? Has it come back? Or is it closed at night? At 11. Closed at 11. Used to be open 24/7, But not anymore. Anyway, so if the bridegroom comes at midnight and your flashlight goes dead, you can't go to Walmart and get batteries, because they close at 11, okay? So this is something to remember. They close at 11. All right. So if he shuts them out and they knock on the door, they call him Lord. They call him Lord. Lord, Lord, open to us. And what does he say? I do not know you. Is that true? I mean, the bridegroom is Jesus, so it's got to be true. If he doesn't know them, then why were they waiting for him in the first? Why are they bridesmaids? You don't ask somebody to be a bridesmaid you don't know, right? So a lot of questions about this. So maybe we could answer some of these questions, maybe we can't. Every commentary you read on this, they go into some detail about the wedding customs of the first century, which is great, except a lot of times they have different wedding customs, and so you wonder how they really knew what the wedding customs were. You know, in our day and age, somebody said, well, what's wedding customs in the United States of America in 2021? You'd start off by saying, well, you know, it's like this, this, and this, except I remember my brother-in-law's cousin, and we went to her wedding, and it was different, and then, you know, so it's kind of hard to generalize, because every wedding's a little bit different. There's some things that we kind of expect to happen, but, you know, everybody does it a little differently. At any rate, there were long engagements. The bridegroom did arrive unexpectedly, and there was usually a procession at night from the bride's parents' home to the new home where the bridegroom and the bride were going to live. And so that was one reason you wanted to have lights, and, you know, this sudden and unexpected arrival was part of the thing, you know. Also, they lasted a long time. We know that because we read in John 2, Jesus and his followers went to the wedding at Cana, and that lasted many days. So the feasting was something you didn't want to miss. It was a really, really big deal. But even though we have all these questions, some we can answer, some we can't, the message of the parable seems to be pretty clear. And that is what we read in verse 13. Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. I mentioned earlier, we've got 4 parables all in a row, all about judgment. Now, that's a topic that we just don't cover much in church anymore. It was a staple in my younger years, you know, Judgment Day. But we don't spend that much time on it anymore. You know, being prepared for the end of your life, being prepared for the next life. You know, what will the Lord say to you in judgment, that sort of thing. We used to talk about that a lot. Here's something that we notice in the book of Matthew is that Jesus is really, in some ways, kind of a black-white kind of a person. There are all these stories that he tells, and they all have this binary division. You know, it's all the grades are pass-fail, you know, and that seems a bit harsh to us because there's a lot of gray out there, right? But no, this is the way that Jesus presents it. If we, and these are just some that we pulled out in the, I think the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about a good tree that gives good fruit and bad trees give bad fruit. The parable of the net let down into the sea, all kinds of fish, but they're sorted out in the end. There's either good fish or bad fish. The parable of the weeds or the tares in the field. The servants come and says, you know, we got this problem. There's all these weeds growing in the wheat. Jesus said, don't weed it, don't pull the weeds out, but at the end of time, we're going to separate them out. There's, in the Sermon on the Mount, they talk about, you know, light, you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth, and contrast to that is darkness, and then salt has lost its savor. There are 2 sons. The man says, son, go work in my vineyard today. He says, I will, but he doesn't go. The other one says, I won't, but later he repents and goes. You know, they're not 3 sons, they're 2 sons. There's the faithful and wise servant. This is the parable it's what I call the bad supervisor servant parable at the end of chapter 24. And he contrasts 2 management styles, you know. One is a faithful and wise servant that does everything he's supposed to do and does a good job. The other one is the wicked servant that, you know, begins to beat the other servants and, you know, get real careless. And then here we have this parable, the wise and the foolish virgins. And we're kind of used to this wise and foolish thing if we've studied the book of Proverbs, right? Really contrast wisdom with folly or foolishness, okay? Wise and foolish, black and white, 2 ways. Now, when we use the word wise here, it doesn't just, you know, we always talk about what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge, and we always say wisdom is applied knowledge, and that's true. It's interesting to me, a lot of times if you're watching a TV show that has a British flavor, or maybe it comes from, BBC or something, they always like to use this word clever. How clever of you, May, to do such and such. Oh, you're so clever. But this kind of wisdom here is not just smarts. You can be really wise to know when you can get away with telling a white lie. You can be really wise in knowing how far you can push the envelope on a contract you've got. Or you can be really wise in knowing how to mislead somebody. These are all ways that you apply knowledge, right? But they're what we call worldly wisdom. This wisdom is not only, doing things that are pragmatic, that lead to a good outcome. It also implies some sort of moral excellence. So, the message of the parable is you want to be like one of the wise virgins, right? It's kind of tragic here at the end. It says you want to keep watch because you do not know the day or the hour that the Lord will come again. And the outcome is, I don't know you. I don't know you for those that don't keep watch. This is an echo, again, of the Sermon on the Mount. So much of Matthew points back to that Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of like, if you drive through Oxford, it's almost hard not to see a building under construction someplace. And, once they get the foundation in, then they frame the building. They put up a lot of 2x4s and, kind of put up where the walls are going to be, and you kind of see the outline of the building. There's still an awful lot of work to do after you get the building framed. So Matthew 5, 6, 7, the Sermon on the Mount, is kind of the framing for the whole gospel. And way back there in chapter 7, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out many demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Well, a couple of things I want to notice here. This knowledge, this relationship appears to be the big thing. The second thing, and we're going to see this in all of our parables today, is that there's a surprise ending. There's a surprise ending. And this is one thing that we as Christians need to always carry around in our hearts, is that the day of judgment will be a day of surprises. There will be people who get in that we didn't expect to get in. And there will be people left out who don't expect to be left out. That's one of the big messages here. Jesus also emphasizes knowing Him, but knowing Him is all tied up in obeying Him. Knowing Him is all tied up in obeying Him. So I think to kind of beat this horse to death, the story of the 10 bridesmaids or 10 virgins, these are some of the points, is there's no substitute for intentional, consistent Christian living. Being around nice people, good people, being around faithful disciples. There were 5 wise and 5 foolish, they were all together. They had a lot in common. They did a lot of stuff in common, but we had some that were prepared and some that weren't. And so, that's not something you can do at the last minute. Well, what about grace? I thought the big thing about Christianity is that we're saved by grace, right? And Jesus, you tell this story. In fact, there are a lot of stories, right? And it's all about obedience. It's all about, quote, having your stuff together, right? It's all about performance. It's all about works salvation. Isn't that antithetical to Christianity because we're saved by grace through faith? I think if we are fair and we read the New Testament with an open mind, we have to acknowledge there is a tension between works and grace. For example, the moral of the story we just read, therefore keep watch because you do not know the day or the hour. You keep watch. You keep working. You be diligent. You be responsible. You be accountable. And, Matthew chapter 7, again, not everyone that says to me, Lord, but he who what? Does the will of the Father. So that's the work side. On the grace side, and these 3 verses here, and I didn't put the citations on here, but these are from Ephesians and Philippians and from 1 Timothy, and these are all from the writing of Paul. He says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God. He has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done. He saved us not because of righteous things we had done, but because of His mercy. Back in the day when we used to have paper newspapers and we just didn't, get the news some other kind of way on our smartphone or something. Paper newspapers, if you travel with your business, Jim, you always run into USA Today. The hotels always give it away. USA Today. And USA Today on the editorial page, they would have, 2 editorials on opposite sides of the issue. Now, I tend to be a little bit conservative, but I would read these things, John, and I never knew, I would read the one side, and I thought, that guy's got a good point. And I read the other, that gal's got a good point, and it was always, it seems like this right here to me. Is it works or is it grace? Which are we going to take? If you want to be a disciple, it's confusing. I think if we do a study of this and really look into it, and we don't read the Bible like W.C. Fields. W.C. Fields, famous film actor way back in the day, and was an alcoholic. And somebody asked him one time, why do you read the Bible? And he said, I'm looking for loopholes. So we can read the Bible like W.C. Fields and look for loopholes, but I think the solution to this conundrum is to realize that there's a 3-dimensional picture in the Bible of salvation that involves both works and grace. If we go right back to Ephesians, first verse that we quoted a moment ago, and for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, he pivots in verse 10, and he says, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which He prepared in advance for us to do. You have been saved by grace, and here's what you've been saved to do. You've been saved to serve. Same verse I quoted from Philippians. He has saved us and called us to a holy life. Okay, that's what we're intended to do. It's not that we're doing that in order to be saved, but because we've been saved, because we're followers of Christ, we're going to live a holy life. And this is one that is from the book of Eric Dahl, I think, because he's the one that quotes this constantly. But actually, I think it's from the book of Titus. He says, for the grace of God that offers salvation has appeared to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. Grace teaches us. And so the real experience of grace, when we get it, then it leads us to a self-controlled, upright, and godly life. But, Matthew's not all works. Now, lots and lots of the parables, lots and lots of the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, are about our performance, about what we need to do. But then you get to chapter 20. This is a review for some of you. You get to chapter 20, and there's this crazy story about these workers in the vineyard, hot summertime. They work, 12, 14 hours, and the guy that works 14 hours gets paid the same thing as the guy that worked in the nice, cool evening, 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. They get paid the same. So there's an element of grace in the book of Matthew also. I'm not going to beat this point to death too much because I think for most of us this is not a really big issue, and that's this idea of predestination. Christians have discussed and dialogued and fought wars over this idea of predestination, and sometimes it's called Calvinism after John Calvin, who was one of the leaders in the Protestant Reformation. And it's the idea that, before you were born, God decided whether you were going to go to heaven or hell. And there's really little, if anything, nothing that you can do about it. And the concept of God electing or choosing or predestining certain people is in the New Testament. Read Romans chapter 8, okay? So it's there, but I think we have to reconcile that with the tremendous emphasis in Matthew and throughout the Bible, in fact, on personal choice, personal decision, personal responsibility. Joshua, what is it, 24? Choose this day whom you will serve. So that's incompatible with the idea that it's already been decided. The way I reconcile this is, yes, God has predestined His people to be saved. It's a group, and you decide if you're going to be part of that group or not. It's like a plane going to, San Francisco. You can get on it, and you're going to San Francisco. Okay, that brings us to a parable about the talents, or the bags of gold, as the newer translations say. So let's read that together. We'll start in verse 14 of Matthew 25. For it will be, the kingdom, okay, for it will be as when a man going on a journey called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them. He made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I've made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not winnow, so I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sowed and gather where I have not winnowed? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth. So the story of the talents, or the bags of gold, we use that word talent now to mean a special ability or gift, and that comes from the Bible, because the original translation, this word talent, means a large sum of money. It means the amount of money a laborer makes, a common worker makes in 6,000 days. So let's say somebody's making $12 an hour, which is, more than minimum wage, but not much. We're talking about 1 talent being between $600,000, that's a silver talent, or if it's a gold talent, $17.2 million. That's 1 talent. And the idea here is the owner, the master, doesn't just give these servants enough money to set up a lemonade stand. It's not just something where they could create a website, okay? This is some serious money. This is some serious money. And so you know what happens, but haven't we kind of heard this plot before? This is just my little thing, but if you watch the first Star Wars movie and you watch The Wizard of Oz, after a while you begin to realize, hey, isn't this kind of the same plot, Aren't there some scenes in these movies where, instead of having like a tin man or a lion, you've got a Wookiee? I mean, It's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Well, this story about the talents, it seems like Jesus keeps telling these stories where somebody gets some responsibility. And the boss or the master or the king or whatever, they go off for a while. Then they come back and they have what we used to call in the old U.S. government performance evaluation. And a lot of you who work for different places, you know, in the U.S. government, it's every 6 months. You got to go and sit down and talk to your boss, and he, you know, kind of tells you you're making an A or a B or a C or whatever it is. You know, you have to have this. It's paperwork, you know. And so they have a performance about it. We've heard this before, but this is something new now, a little wrinkle in this one. The amount of money they get, 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent, each according to his ability. At any rate, happy ending for the guys with the big money because they double their money. They double their money. So how do you double your money? It doesn't say whether he's gone for a year or for 10 years or for 2 years. This is one of these graphs you see in these, you know, stuff about investing. If you put $10,000 in 5 years ago, today, if you're on the blue curve there, you would have about $18,000, $19,000. No, actually more than that. It's more like, what, $19,500, I think. If you're on the gold curve, which is the S&P 500, by the way, then you'd have more than $22,000. Isn't that great? Just put it in there and wait. Except, notice what it says in black. They all say this. The performance data featured represents past performance, which is no guarantee of future results. So when I read this parable, I always ask myself, always ask the Lord, I say, okay, suppose you've given me 2 talents. I'm not a 5-talent man, but suppose you give me 2 talents. And I go out here and put your money to work, quote unquote, that's what it says, put your money to work, and I lose most of it. And so when you come back, I've got 0.7 talents left. What about me? Am I going to get the boot? Because I worked at it, I tried, I just failed. You know, what about that? What about that plot twist? What about that wrinkle? But these guys, they both have similar outcomes. And so I'm thinking maybe the message for us as disciples is that when God blesses us with talents, there's really only one way that you can really mess up, and that's to bury it in the ground. As long as you're putting it to work, as long as you're putting it out there, then that's good. That's going to be good, okay? And however we choose to keep score, you know, God's score is the one that really counts. Well, the real twist in the plot here is not, you know, oh, that's great, double your money, come on in, you're going to get a lot of good stuff here, we're going to give you more, we're going to promote you, you know, we got that, okay. But the interesting conversation is with the 1-talent servant and the master. And, you know, I've looked at this conversation a couple of different ways, and one is on the slide here, this blame shifting. That he comes in and he's kind of got a chip on his shoulder, and he realizes that he's underperformed the other 2 guys, okay? And so he's you know, itching for a fight with the boss. And so his objective in the conversation is to point out to the boss that it's not his fault, it's really the boss's fault. I think this is typical of the way that a lot of us approach God. You know, great commentary on marriage is when God goes looking for Adam and he says, Adam, what's been going on here? And Adam says, the woman that you gave me, you know, it's you gave me this woman. That's the problem. That's you. It's your fault. So he starts off and says, you are a hard man. I knew that. So, you know, since you're such a hard case, I just was afraid and I couldn't do anything because you were so hard. Another way to look at this, though, is that this 1-talent servant comes into the meeting thinking, I'm going to get an award because I have done what he wanted me to do. I haven't lost anything, okay? I've got it right here. I've got the money that he gave me, and so he ought to be perfectly satisfied, and he's the one that's really surprised because the master is so unhappy with him. He calls him a wicked, lazy servant. I think it gives us a little perspective on this parable if we see what the master is saying about putting the money on deposit with the bankers. Let's see, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, okay. Just ignore the text here for a second, and you see the coins there, okay? And the point is this. Back then, it was perfectly acceptable if you wanted to, take care of some money in a very secure way that you would bury it. Remember Matthew 13, the parable of the buried treasure. Man, he finds some buried treasure. He goes and buys the property so he can get the treasure. Tell me, covers it back up, goes and buys the property. 2007, Becky and I went on a business trip to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary. How romantic. Anyway, we were in St. Louis, and they had a exhibit there of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Neat. So we go to see the exhibit of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and all the Dead Sea Scrolls there are replicas. The nation of Israel is not going to let the Dead Sea Scrolls go out of their borders, okay? That's not going to happen. But they were nice-looking replicas. They were really neat. But one thing they had there that was real is in this community that the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, the Qumran community, they didn't believe in property. Everything was communal, but they had to have some money to get by somehow, and so they had buried a cache of coins. And there were the real coins. I could almost see Jesus holding that up and said, whose inscription is this? Maybe that was the coin he held up, because it's from the 1st century, okay? So the real coins, it was perfectly okay to bury money, okay? That was like you buying a low-interest CD today. You're not going to make much money on it, but you're not going to lose anything, right? Go down to the bank and ask them what they're paying on savings accounts and CDs right now. It's not very much, okay? It's just a tiny, but it's secure. It's secure. You come back 5 years later, there's your money. It doesn't grow very much. Bankers back then, the master said, should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so at least I could have gotten some interest. Back then, they didn't have the FDIC, okay? And they didn't have the Fed, and so interest rates for this sort of thing tended to be a lot higher. Risk levels higher too, probably, but you could really make some money on it. And he said, you didn't have to start a business. You could have just put it on deposit with the bankers, and I would have made something. Well, we just wind this up today. We just have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and the conclusion of this parable sounds awfully harsh to me. It sounds like a predatory capitalism, okay? Whoever has will be given more, and they'll have an abundance. And whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. It's kind of like the old expression that we have, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And while I'm, conservative and I believe in capitalism and all that sort of stuff, I'll admit that we've had a problem during the pandemic. And that is, some of us have done very well. It's those of us who could afford to have money invested, the stock market's actually gone up dramatically in the last 2 years, while other people in certain industries have had tremendous amount of suffering because of the way the economy was shut down. And so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and that's not fair. Because some of those folks, frankly, work a lot harder than the rich people do. They deserve it, but no, that's not what's happening. Well, another way to look at that, instead of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, is this other expression you see highlighted on the screen, and that is Jesus saying, use it or lose it. Use it or lose it. And he's saying if we invest ourselves, whatever resources we have, whatever energy, talent, time, money we have, then we'll be blessed with more responsibility, more opportunity. And so that seems to be what he's trying to convey to us there. We'll start here next time. I hope you can be with us in our study, and we're going to talk about why Jesus had such an obsession with punishment. To our ears and eyes, it seems kind of strange. But we're going to pick up here, and we'll go on into the parable of the sheep and the goats. So thank you for your attention and time in our study. I hope you'll be with us next week. In the meantime, why not do some reading and study in the book of Matthew?